13 pointless, meandering episodes of character-driven schlock, we can finally get to the show that everyone wanted to see in the first place. A superhero show!
Welcome, Gothamites, to another episode of the Arkham Sessions. My name is Brian Ward. With me, as always, is the psychologist to the superheroes, superheroines, and supervillains of Gotham City and beyond, Dr. Drea Letamendi. Hello, Drea.
Hi, Brian. How are you?
I'm doing exceptionally well. I just love the fact that we are finally sitting down.
We are not on the same page.
Well, what I mean is, this is sort of my opportunity to escape. This is my release, having this podcast with you. And so getting to sit down after so many weeks of not really doing it is a really big deal for me. So
I would agree with that. I feel like I'm bringing other people into the room. We're having a bigger conversation than just, how many coronavirus cases are there today, and when is the next grocery run, and other quarantine related stressors. So I'm with you there. It's been a hard couple of weeks, but I think my motivation is a little bit stronger these last few days, and I'm looking forward to this episode. I'm excited to we're getting near the end of this season of Doom Patrol, and I can tell that the show is starting to peak. Yeah,
we learned that in episode 13, which is the one that we're doing now, Flex Patrol, it has become everything up to this point has been an origin story for the superhero team. By the way, if you hear some crunching, that is our cat, Rocket, who's decided that now is the time to have some food while we are sitting there at the home office with our sort of new recording setup, our temporary recording setup. So let's talk first about a couple of things that we have in-house. Patreon. As we teased, the poll for what we're covering next did in fact end in a tie. So that means we are split between two different options. There is the Marvel Cinematic Universe, in which we would go through movie by movie and talk about the psychology, the real psychology, but also possibly even the real sciences behind each of the movies.
Which could be a pretty long endeavor. I think that could be one of our biggest projects.
Yeah, for sure. And then there is also the very first season of Steven Universe, which you and I have never seen. You may have seen an episode or two. I have never seen an episode of the show. So it was highly recommended that you analyze it. And so we are throwing that out as an option.
Watchmen didn't get enough votes to even be in the final round here, which surprises me.
Yeah.
So we have two very different projects. One, Steven Universe is another animated show.
Ostensibly for children,
yeah, I think it's one of those shows, and I've seen very, very little of it, but I think it's one of those shows that has the ability to be a good kids show, but also weaves in adult topics.
Oh, for sure.
And from what my colleagues and friends are saying, really, isn't a light touch to some of those adult topics. It's a worthwhile, meaningful coverage of things around identity, relationships, friendships, and could be a really interesting journey for us. Meanwhile, Marvel, it takes us into a cinematic universe. So that's somewhat new for us. We've done films before, but certainly not this giant collection.
Yeah.
and it's Marvel. So we're delving into the other big one in terms of the comics landscape, which I would be very excited about. We don't really talk about Marvel on our show, so it would be exciting to delve into that territory.
And you've had some articles in the past on some of the Marvel movies. I'm thinking specifically about Iron Man 3. I remember you doing a whole thing on post-traumatic stress that you wrote for Fandom or one of those, or it was for...
That was for The Hollywood Reporter.
The Hollywood Reporter. And so I'm excited about the possibility of talking about stuff like that. But we are open to both shows, and that's why we are throwing it back to our Patreon listeners who have donated $3 or more. We're doing a runoff. It is Marvel Cinematic Universe or it is Steven Universe's first season. So as of probably Monday, because many of you are hearing this on Saturday, because our Patreon listeners will get to it on Friday. On this coming Monday,
what are days though? I just stop. Like, just say, this will happen. Just check the site; it'll be on there.
Yeah. Well, on July 11th, 12th, 13th, on July 13th. We will have a poll up on patreon.com/Arkham Sessions, where you will get to decide between the Marvel Cinematic Universe and Steven Universe's first season.
What is July? Okay.
Look.
It's okay.
Another big thing is we are allowed to announce that you and I did a panel for Comic-Con at home. And it wasn't just us. We had some guests. We revived an old panel, a topic that you and I first discovered was really popular at WonderCon a few years back. We took it to Comic-Con and it was even more popular. And we had four successful iterations and a fifth that we just don't talk about. It's the psychology of Star Trek versus Star Wars between you, a huge Star Wars fan, and Dr. Ali Mattu, a huge Star Trek fan. The two of you go head to head to determine which of the two franchises holds more psychological, credible weight. And you will be joined by special guests. Do we talk about who the special guests are now, or do we let people? We can wait. Okay. But as always, we have special guests who are linked to these two franchises joining us. And
this is the first time we've been able to talk about the more recent.
Yeah, we've never talked about the JJ verse or the sequel trilogy,
any of the sequels,
or Picard, or any Discovery.
We had a lot to talk about for sure.
Yeah, so that is going up. Stay tuned to Comic-Con's official Twitter handle and their website, because they are putting those panels up exclusively, and then there will be an extended version going up on our sites later. So stay tuned for that. That will be happening during the week that Comic-Con normally would have been happening. That is July 22nd through 26th. And they're handling it like an actual panel. So it'll go up at like 4 o'clock on a certain day, or whatever. So
it is true. While I'm disappointed that we can't be at Comic-Con and Star Wars Celebration and New York Comic-Con, WonderCon, all the ones that are remote experiences this year, I do appreciate how some of the silver linings here. One is that Comic-Con, a convention that has essentially exploded, one that's been, in addition to being so crowded and so well loved and sought after, is also a show that is hard to get to now.
Yeah.
So they've made their panels accessible. They've essentially made their show available to the community
and
at
for
large.
Free. This isn't for people who had already paid and were going to get in through their badges. This is going to be available for free to anyone who goes to Comic-Con's YouTube page. So that's pretty awesome. It might be the first time that you've ever experienced a Comic-Con panel.
Hey, your dad can watch our panel.
Yes, my dad can watch our panel. Let's talk about our episode today because it's a big one. We teased Flex Mentallo in the last episode, Cyborg Patrol, where we got to meet Vic's cell neighbor. And it turns out that we were right. The burly man who is addicted to soap operas is in fact Flex Mentallo. So for those who are unfamiliar with Flex, he has one of the better powers, I think, in the DC universe. Just by flexing his muscles, he has the ability to alter reality. So we see in the beginning of this episode, he is using that in order to conjure up food for a picnic for him and his wife Dolores. He is also able to bend a tree branch without even touching it in order to rescue a cat. He's that kind of wholesome, do good, a clearly a comic strip type superhero who walks around town in his little short undies and is just flexing around doing whatever.
He has a very vintage classic appearance.
Yeah.
So his powers. At first, it was very unclear to me. I didn't understand what he was doing because he would flex his muscles and then something would appear. But then he would also flex his muscles, and there would be like a supernatural force, some kind of dimensional wave.
Yeah.
So it sounds like there's some telekinesis. There's some additional things there happening.
I'm a little disappointed because in the comics, whenever he flexes his muscle and uses his powers, the words "hero of the beach" appear over his head.
Why?
Because it's Doom Patrol. I mean, it's just a weird.
But why the beach?
Oh, because you got the muscle man on the beach. You do the flexing on the beach. Well, we have also, if we want to go into sort of the comic book lore of Flex, there was a period of time where it was talked about that he was very much always picked on and bullied while on the beach and decided to become a muscle man. Now, what's really interesting, and they kind of alluded to this a little bit, there's a moment where Jane asks him if he remembered a man named Wally Sage, presumably a person who ended up putting him in this comic book ad that Danny the Street gave them the comic and Flex was missing from it. And he didn't remember Wally, but that is directly taken from the comic. Wally was a child psychic who created Flex with a green pen. So,
what?
So Flex is, it was basically a parody comic book called My Greenest Adventures, which is a parody of My Greatest Adventures, which was, what Doom Patrol became, or what it was renamed to, Doom Patrol. And so this child who was psychic and had a green pen was able to create beings and bring them into existence. And Flex Mentallo is one of those characters.
So he drew this muscle man who is almost a stereotype, very his physique is so exaggerated, and I understand why. He's very tall, broad-shouldered, muscle guy, and his personality is, I wouldn't say he's simple, because he's not, but he seems to just be eager to please and very jovial and kind of...
He's so incredibly wholesome.
Yeah.
And he himself is a bit of a parody. I mean, if you remember those when you go back and you look at old comic books of yours, you'll find like the muscle man, Charles Atlas.
I do remember that image.
You remember the Charles Atlas image. He is basically a parody of that ad. And so he's got that smile. In fact, Dolores even says, regardless of how perfect his body is, his greatest flex is his smile. And so he's got that same...
well, and what we know about Doom Patrol is that nothing is ever as it appears, or there is often a distorted, deeper meaning to people's interactions, to their psyche, to their relationships. So this is a character that we're introduced to. We know we're supposed to recognize him. There's a flashback where he's with his young wife, which is important because we actually see her later. And then we see
we've seen her before as well. Yes.
Yeah. We see her young for the first time.
Yes.
I don't know, maybe it's the 60s in this flashback.
That's what I love about this series is you never know.
I don't know.
Like they're all from different time periods and it's
and
just
they don't
okay.
age. Like the main characters don't age. So I never really know. But we are to presume that this is a simpler time. And it
feels very much like Back to the Future, 1955.
Yeah.
It's got that sort of feeling to it.
But he's taken. So he tries to rescue a small kitten, a little boy. It's interesting that you talk about a little boy creating him, because a little boy approaches him and says, there's a small kitten crying in a tree. Flex Mentallo saves the kitten, and then the kitten emits this ray of, I don't know, supernatural.
It's basically a ghost trap. He sucks him in.
up. Yeah. And then next thing we know,
he's talking into a watch saying, that the target has been acquired. And so we know that the kid was working for the Bureau. And so now Flex, who continues to be his wholesome self, refuses to succumb to the torture, and he is tortured significantly by the Bureau, as we learn that they tend to do, and he refuses to give in and stop calling himself Flex Mentallo until we see that Dolores has been captured. She is also being tortured. She is being held from him. We see the origin of the television in his room. They are conditioning him to want to watch television because television is where he is going to see his wife once a week at the same time, every day, one day a week. And so he is being conditioned to do what they want him to do, and his reward is that he will get to turn on the television and for a half hour see his wife. Not interact with her necessarily, but he'll get to see her. So they are keeping him apart.
Right.
And that becomes a point where he forgets who he is. He forgets that he has powers. He is conditioned with, do what we say and we will reward you. And the next thing you know, however many years have gone by, decades,
yeah.
And he is watching soap operas, and he is tuned into that every day. He has now become a disciple of this soap opera. And we learn that the origins are basically because at some time, once a week, possibly every day or whatever, they would feed him his wife. And then at some point they stopped because he has forgotten about her. He has forgotten who he is, and he now works for the Bureau.
They are, I think for folks not familiar with the Bureau, this is, I think I said on a show earlier, this is the opposite of the Hellboys paranormal group. Like this is a government run prison, essentially, where they exploit the paranormal, supernatural abilities of the people that they incarcerate. So what I learned about this character is that based on his abilities around super strength and being able to manipulate reality and the environment, they're essentially sending him on these missions, and he works for them, but he's losing his sense of self. He doesn't really know. He's over the decades, he's lost connection with Flex Mentallo. He's now, even though he still has those abilities, he's now a completely different person.
Yes.
And there are other people in the facility. We learned that while he's there, 30 years ago, Negative Man is also being experimented on.
Yes.
in a cell next to him. And that's where we learn that they actually met then, and that the energy inside Negative Man essentially reaches out to Flex Mentallo for help.
Yes. Yes, because Larry won't. The spirit leaves Larry's body and actually begins interacting with Flex. And I've got the audio of that here. Let's take a listen.
Jesus! I'm Flex Mentallo. Man of muscle mystery. Nice to meet you, too. Where are you from there, Sparky? What is that, some kind of other dimension, or? Well, sure, I can get you back there. I can open up a door anywhere.
What's interesting about this audio is Flex can understand the negative spirit. He is speaking with it. And he...
It kind of bothers me because, again, I don't really understand his powers. And so I think I'm just trying to get to know individuals by their abilities. And it
might not even be his powers. It might just be, we don't know because it's Doom Patrol, but for whatever reason, Flex has the ability to understand the negative spirit speaking.
Which Larry cannot.
Larry cannot. And to the best of our knowledge, no one else can.
Right.
But what I really liked about this moment is that Flex takes the opportunity, and again, this could be that wholesome 50s quality about him. He starts asking the spirit about himself. You know, he starts, you know, hey, who are you? Where are you from?
I don't like it.
You know, like,
I don't like it.
But then, as we just heard, he responds, is that like a different dimension? So like the spirit is telling him. He's telling him where he's from.
He's able to gather information that like not even the experimenters know about.
Yeah. Just by being a nice guy. And so it gets to a point where Flex decides he wants to help the negative spirit escape. The negative spirit is a good entity in Flex's life. Mm-hmm. He is giving him a purpose to escape this place until he discovers that his wife has been captured. And then in a very heartbreaking moment where he is basically begging Larry to help him out so that he can rescue the negative spirit, that's when they tell him that his wife has been captured and that he can see her on television once a week. And then he, in a very heartbreaking moment, says, you know, sorry, Sparky. And he's talking to the negative spirit. He's basically given in, and he acknowledges in that moment that he can't be the hero that the negative spirit needs. Larry is seeing all of this in a flashback because the negative spirit has put its hand inside his head and is showing it to him.
So what we're seeing is basically a teaching moment between the energy and Larry. I do want to shift a little bit because I want to name some aspects of the show that seem to cling together, that I do think there's a theme here going amidst what is often chaotic and weird, bizarre, sometimes I have to admit distracting about this show because there's just so much going on. But this is another strong episode, and I think I have a couple reasons why I think that. But shifting to so I want to put a little pin in the idea that Flex Mentallo makes a difficult decision, but one that in the moment he believes is the best for his situation and his wife's situation. Yeah. Shifting to Rita, she is assisting Cyborg. In the ending of the last episode, Cyborg has punched his father to the degree of unconsciousness, and they've rushed him to the hospital. And Rita and Cyborg are coming to terms with kind of the outcome of this, that he is, Cyborg believes he's killed him. We learn that his father has survived the injuries and is, I'm not sure if he's in a coma or on a ventilator, but he's still considered alive. And Rita has a moment in the hospital waiting room. It's clear that she's uncomfortable there. She indicates that she's anxious there. We hear the baby crying, and you and I looked at each other like, okay, we still haven't resolved this. Like, why?
It's the baby.
Why does a baby crying make her uncomfortable? There's been some trauma in her past. She attempts to leave the hospital, and an old, very, very old, frail gentleman asks for her assistance. He needs help walking back to his room.
And this gentleman is?
This gentleman is
the wonderful Ed Asner.
Yes.
He is
Ed
made
Asner,
a
who I
guest
thought
appearance.
was not alive anymore. And I was
You were wrong.
glad to hear he's alive. Wonderful actor and very gentle, warm old man. Like I can see why he's the one. He's so gentle and so quiet, and she just needs to talk to somebody. And he barely even probes. He's just asking, her to talk to him and to spend some time with him.
Well, he acknowledges that he made a mistake with his own family. He acknowledges that one night he just left in the blue, and never returned. And so it's a great regret for him, and he admits that, and he's basically giving her the lesson of owning your mistakes. And with that, you will then regain your own power. And so, which is the theme.
That is the theme. We learn what she experienced. She tells this. She just recalls these accounts of being an actress. Again, I think back in maybe the 50s or 60s. And she describes feeling that she's sort of aging out of the roles that she typically takes, that are typically given to her. And she realizes that she takes on this new role where she can groom younger women to come into the industry, meet with, who is it, a director?
It's the producer.
It's the producer?
It's the same producer we saw in flashbacks previous, where he sort of hit on her and she rebuffed him. And as a result, her career did not go to the heights that others who did not decline his offers. And remember, at the time, we wondered, because in that same episode, we saw her have this image of sort of a suicided woman. And the question was, okay, well, at the time was she in some way responsible for pushing this girl on this guy? Because clearly this image of this woman haunted her. And we find out in this episode that is in fact the case, that even though she rebuffed his sexual offers, she was basically trafficking women to the producer. Their careers would go sky high. She even mentions one of them was sobbing through an Academy Award speech at one point. And so Rita is hooking this producer up with these actresses. This one actress becomes pregnant, has a baby, and the producer decides he's not going to be a father. He shuns the woman, turns his back on the child entirely. Rita gives the woman $100 with the assumption that this girl would get back on her feet. Mm-hmm. And instead, in a matter of days, she learns that the woman had suicided, and there was no mention of the baby. So this is why the baby has haunted Rita, is this not knowing what this woman did. And she mentions at one point even having toyed with the fact that, or having toyed with the idea that she would take responsibility for the child at some point, but then didn't. And there's a key piece. It's a very long story, so I'm not going to play it all here, but there's one line of dialogue that absolutely struck me as particularly relevant right now. I want to play that for you. Here we go.
Looking the other way should be so much harder than it actually is.
So we're learning at this moment that Rita feels the complexity here is that she feels responsible for many things. The end of this woman's life, essentially the fact that this woman died by suicide is something that weighs heavily on Rita. And I believe that that she carries the guilt of participating in the exploitation of other women. That somehow she was able to stay clear of that she was ancillary to this, but yet found that because of the decisions that she made, other women were harmed.
Yeah.
So it's not as if she was complicit and just turned the other way. She was participating in bringing women to this offender.
Yeah.
And that has been weighing heavily on her.
And it was for her own benefit because even though she didn't rise up to stardom the way the other girls did, but she kept getting calls for work. And in fact, it was the fact that the phone rang influenced her decision not to take care of the child. You know, the fact that she was offered a movie in a starring role for the first time in forever basically made her forget all about having toyed with this idea. So ultimately, the episode wraps up with them having realized, with Rita realizing that by owning her past, that she is going to be able to then regain her power and control her identity. And then Flex has the same realization. They present Dolores to him. Dolores is significantly older now, and she has been working for the Bureau. In fact, she's the woman who...
And she's been brainwashed, too. So she's not herself.
She doesn't remember Flex right away. Flex doesn't remember her right away. They then start to remember one another, and they both embrace, and then
it's the snap. Like, she starts to disintegrate like one would during the snap.
Yeah. She basically ashes away. Well, and that's from the comic. I mean, in the comic, they established that she had been programmed by the Bureau to self-destruct should she ever come in contact with Flex again. And so that's exactly what happens. Her body just self-destructs, similar to like a Mission Impossible tape. And so this then creates sort of a catalyst for Flex. Flex is now back. He screams, he flexes, all the power in the city goes out, and we now know that Flex Mentallo is the leader of this group that is going to go after the Bureau.
It's just like the Quickening.
It is just like the Quickening.
Which I just recently learned about.
Yeah.
He is the entire, all the electrical circuits are haywire and exploding, and he is clearly back.
Let's talk about electrical circuits that are haywiring. So at the same time that he regains his power by owning his mistake, Vic regains his power by owning his mistake, and he reinstalls Grid, which is what his father was trying to do all along. Then Rita has her breakthrough. Larry, on the other hand, has decided to let go of the negative spirit. He now remembers, or he now acknowledges, that the two of them aren't bound to one another. The negative spirit does not have to live inside of him to exist. So he decides, I'm going to let you go and be free and be safe, and I'm going to die the way I should have however many years ago in the plane crash. And he actually begins to die. He is moments away from death when the negative spirit, who contemplates leaving, comes back and chooses to go back inside of Larry's body. So the negative spirit genuinely is keeping Larry alive, but they are not bound to one another. And so there are mistakes acknowledged. And you know, although Larry, it's interesting, he is choosing, because of his new relationship to the negative spirit, to free it, to not put it through the pain of having to be there and having to, you know, basically live with Larry. But he is not embracing life the way the others are. He is, in fact, embracing the idea of death until the negative spirit jumps back inside of him, brings him back from the cusp, and Larry says, "I think we're going to be okay." We learn that all of this, including Ed Asner's part, has been sort of manipulated once again by Mr. Nobody. Ed Asner says, "Well done, Rita," and then morphs into Mr. Nobody. So this is another one of those layers that I think is brilliant about this show. Mr. Nobody desperately wants this group to become a super team. And so he is doing everything he can, including being the catalyst for their own development and their own recognition of their past horrors. Like up to this point, he's been threatening to use this past trauma against them. But really what he's been doing is pushing them toward a resolution, toward recovery, so that he can then battle them properly. With the one exception of Cyborg. Like even when we see Mr. Nobody, we see the giant promotional poster for DC Universe's Doom Patrol Season 1. It's the poster, everyone's seen the illustrated cover, and he punches out Cyborg's face. Like he doesn't want Cyborg to be there because we've acknowledged that Cyborg is probably the one thing that can defeat Mr. Nobody. So he wants this team intact as a straightforward superhero team, but he doesn't want Cyborg to be a part of it, which is why he's been torturing that kid so much more than helping him the way that he's been helping others. I'm fascinated.
That is interesting because, well, two things. The villain is breaking the fourth wall to tell us he's the villain and to do some things that I know I've said are a little weird for me, but I guess I like this because... And
when we say breaking the fourth wall, we're actually talking like he's wearing the DC hat, he's wearing the Doom Patrol t-shirt, and we're looking at basically the Blu-ray box art. So he is very much...
He's pointing to the Doom Patrol poster and like it's very... I know you said that, but it's jarring, but it's also... I think it serves to do what we're doing, which is to unpack it and consider it a story. Like this is, none of this is real. We're just kind of in this adventure, and we're commenting on it. We're observing it. We're in witness to it, and it's an exercise for all of us. And he's taking us through that. The thing that doesn't make him a villain is that he's drawing us to ideas that I think we need to begin to embrace. The one in this particular episode is what you noted. Are we open to making mistakes and not just failing and having setbacks, but going back to the things that we did wrong or the things that were the error of our ways? It isn't, I think in this episode for Rita to acknowledge that she has been avoiding even thinking about this relationship that she had or this participation in something really horrendous and exploitative. It's also about confronting what about those decisions? What about that entrenchment? What about that participation did she not agree with?
Yeah.
When you come to terms with those reactions, those feelings, you grow. But we don't like to do it. I mean, no one wants to go back and examine their mistakes.
Yeah.
It turns out that we're actually better off doing that. And there's a sub-discipline in psychology. There are people that actually study the experiences of addressing mistakes, examining our own mistakes. And there are some really interesting findings. Some of these findings are coming from academics, where researchers will look at the different ways in which professors or instructors will teach. And there have been some statements that in the U.S. we tend to ignore. We tend to just kind of look at the positives and praise good answers, right answers, and we don't really talk about why the wrong answers are wrong or that you got them wrong. It's
Right.
really just, that whatever that red circled number is at the top, that's everything you got right, and that's what you should pay attention to.
Gotcha.
The international studies show that for some countries and some places where there are some more efforts to look at the mistakes, to look at the wrong answers, and to just examine like what were the mishaps there, what was even in math problems, for instance, what were the mistakes in a certain problem, that children who undergo this examination of the wrong answers do much better in the long run. They actually score higher in their math exams and in these various subjects in school in the long run.
Interesting.
So overall, I think even though our culture in the US, like we have a tendency to cover up mistakes and to not talk about them, there seems to be a benefit to examining the ins and outs of wrong answers, so to speak. I will say, and maybe we can link this in our show, that there's a book called The Learning Gap, which describes some of the research that I've just mentioned here. And there's also a pretty impressive scientific review called Learning from Errors, which was published as a result of the psychology field moving away from this idea that errors and flaws don't really shape behavior, that it's really only the positives. The behaviorism movement in psychology, for you, I mean, think about like those pigeon studies and Pavlov and some of these like maybe classic studies. They really were focusing so much and primed us to get entrenched in what's right and not in the errors and not in the mistakes. So we really kind of shifted things in psychology, and we started to look at how development and growth could come from actually the wrong answers. And I think this makes a lot of sense for us, right? That it's almost as if there's this avoidance or allergy to mistakes. It's this, I don't know, maybe wanting to stay away from ideas of failure. Mm-hmm. It's too vulnerable. It's too risky. It makes us feel less than. And so we avoid those situations where there might be an error because we don't want to interpret ourselves as being failures. But it's important because examining the wrong answers will inform us of our own gaps, like some of the things that we actually do need to work on, which is important. Yeah. Let's keep that in mind for a topic I'm about to talk about. But I know we've talked about growth mindset, for instance. The emerging studies around addressing setbacks and mistakes is very aligned with the research around the growth mindset. This idea that if we examine gaps, if we work harder, we can actually make profound differences in our own capacities. I think that's what a lot of us want to do. And it also turns out that there are like brain studies that look at this, that the people who are drawn to or willing to look at their mistakes have a different brain pattern. And, again, this goes to the likelihood that they may grow from what they learn about the mistakes they made. Most of these studies are looking at very simple mistakes, errors that you can catch in a test or a quiz, things like that. And I think it's important not only to challenge the idea that intelligence is fixed, but also to challenge this idea of our current cancel culture. In that the mistakes I've been referencing are ones that hopefully we can overcome. there are some bigger mistakes that we might make in our lives that could make just, profound differences in what happens to us. And I think here it's important to kind of draw those lines and make those parallels to what we know about the growth mindset. What Rita did, imagine if if someone knew about this, like let's say there was another woman that was friends with the woman who died by suicide and wrote a dozen tweets.
Rita's the one.
Yeah, and she wrote a dozen tweets about Rita. We learned that Rita not only groomed these women, but participated in the abuse of these women. There is a particular case happening as we speak in the news that is very similar in real life to this kind of situation. I imagine that a person like Rita would be canceled in this current cancel culture.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think we've maybe named this term on the show, but I'm going to use Vice's definition of our cancel culture, which they describe as a way for marginalized communities to publicly assert their value systems through pop culture. When I read pop culture, I think we know that means social media, digital identities, digital communities, these bigger, broader ways, media, ways that we can harness our ability to get through to wide audiences and make these claims. I found
interesting.
I mean,
that's not yes, that's the conduit by which they do it. But I think when I hear pop culture used in that definition, I use that it's easier to use these people who are in the media, film, television, novelists, journalists, whomever, it's easier to use them as examples and to change the culture by using no one cares if Joe down the street.
You can't really cancel Joe down the street.
Joe down
Sorry,
the street.
Joe. But you're right. And J.K. Rowling is a good example of this. She said recently some pretty overt statements that are anti-trans, and many of her fans rallied to challenge her, but also to agree not to support her anymore. And I think this is an example of the cancel culture really working in a very insidious way. But perhaps this is what you're saying. They're essentially leveraging her status, like she's so popular and so
yes.
And she herself has a giant community, and this is one way to mark to help the rest of the community decide what is right and wrong, and the consequence is pretty severe. And so I'm sure, as you can tell, I have some hesitation about, or maybe some I have questions about whether our practices within the cancel culture are really beneficial in the long run.
Yeah.
I just named one particular outcome that I think is beneficial. The idea that we are pointing to a practice or a behavior and demonstrating to larger communities that that's wrong, that that's unacceptable.
And that you can be punished for it.
Yeah. And I think discriminatory behavior, and I think racial bias, and certainly statements that are caught on camera and in writing should be used to help us understand and help others understand what is challenging social change, or what is toxic to our efforts for equality and for visibility. So I think it can be helpful.
Yeah.
And you can tell that I'm also hesitant to be in full support of the cancel culture because of perhaps the swiftness that this happens, and some of the inability for us to examine and explore what we can learn from dialogue versus completely omitting the person from
So you're saying,
the conversation.
The moment someone tweets about it, it must be true, and therefore we cancel them without having had the conversation. So really, we're just eliminating a problem. We're not actually changing anything. Well, we're not even eliminating the problem. We are simply casting aside a public figure that was part of the problem, and then pretending like we have somehow fixed something.
Mm-hmm. And this is why some people have come forward to say we shouldn't be canceling people. We should be canceling behavior. We should be canceling actions. We should be canceling the overt demonstrations of ignorance, of, again, discrimination, racial bias. We should point to those behaviors and say why they're unacceptable, but not to cancel the person because of what you said. How are we then addressing the root of the problem? How are we inviting the person to unlearn some of their beliefs and their principles if they have a willingness to do so? How are we able ourselves to be in spaces of difference and dissonance, and understand where someone is coming from? Again, we have our limits, and we can tolerate. I think I would say that I have a limit to what I can tolerate in terms of difference, but it's at least an exercise in examining how we can develop as a community in being more learned, more pro-social, more emotionally compassionate. And, again, there may be ways to invite people to change their perspectives rather than to just disinvite them from the entire party, so to speak.
So you're saying become a little bit more empathetic, find out, as you've constantly sort of used as a platform, not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. Why do you feel this way? How can it be changed? How can we make things different? How can we make you a better person rather than simply burning them at the stake?
Well, yeah. And I think having an understanding of, is the art different than the person? I know you and I have talked about this before. I think even on our show, where we wondered how to separate the product or the art that a person makes and who they are as a person.
Going back to J.K. Rowling as an example, people have been saying, especially people who starred in the movies, they were like, don't let what you have learned from this person's writing be affected by the fact that the person turned out to have negative views or views that were different than yours. It's how I felt when we talked. There was a few years ago when I remember Joss Whedon apparently is constantly in trouble these days. But back when it was revealed that he cheated on his wife during the making of Buffy and Angel and was kind of a horrible human being at that point. I remember everyone saying, Buffy is now ruined for me. And I'm like, well, but why? If what you learned from Buffy is positive, if what you can take and use in your life is positive from that experience, why does his creation of it and having done things behind the scenes affect that? Why,
Well, I think let's actually unpack that, because I've heard similar struggles. One is that as humans, we have a very difficult time entertaining and sitting with two very opposing ideas. And I think that people see this as, well, this is a thing I love and that is a person I hate. And so I have to reconcile
by loving this, I am somehow celebrating them, and I don't want to.
Yes.
Right.
So I think we do need to work on adding more complexity to our emotional functioning here. Like, how can we regulate that dissonance a little bit better? What are the things that they can do? Today, I actually read a guide that someone posted about J.K. Rowling saying, you can cancel J.K. Now, this is not this is not in alignment with what I said earlier, but you can cancel J.K. Rowling while keeping Harry Potter. So this is what they recommend. Do not buy new books. You can get used books. That's fine. Do not buy official merch. Do not see the play. Don't rent or buy the movies. Don't see the movies in the theater, because she gets a percentage of the theme park, the new books, the ticket and food and merch those sales. Some of that goes to her. alternatives. You could go to the library to get the books and DVDs. You could support queer merch creators who are in the space, in the fandom. You could read fanfic, which is celebrating the stories, but not written by her. And one thing that I do want to say here about this guide and what could be helpful is this says you can queer the fandom. So what that means is rather than spend all your energy silencing and canceling her, spend your energy uplifting the voices of trans nerds, of trans Harry Potter fans, create more trans-centered fanfics, create more trans fan art, be vocal, be, kind of, I guess we're saying we can, with that positive noise, you can kind of silence and not make J.K. Rowling's voice as prominent. And I think this is a good strategy because so far what I've seen up till now is a lot of highlighting and celebrating and championing the wrong thing, like that she said wrong things, but she's still so center in this conversation. I think cancel culture is not a simple thing. It's not. I think it can be a spectrum of actions where cancel culture isn't just someone says a thing and we eliminate them, we excommunicate them, but more or less, well, what are the ways in which we can address the nuances of this and still celebrate what's good?
Yeah, because what's better? Simply punishing her by taking away her money, which, by the way, it wouldn't matter if you don't go to a Universal Park for the rest of your life, or if you don't buy a J.K. Rowling book off the shelves at a new retailer, or if you don't go and see the next Fantastic Beasts. She has already got godlike money. Like you're not going to hurt her. She's not touchable in that regard. Now you could come back and say, yeah, but it's the point, it's the principle of it. We're going to make her hurt. Well, maybe, but what is better? Making her hurt in that sort of vindictive way of like, okay, you said something I didn't like. Now I'm going to make you feel the pain, or genuinely trying to change her. At what point can you maybe turn her into an ally? And maybe you can't. I don't know. But the idea that you're going to cancel her and somehow that's going to hurt her. Now I realize not everyone that is being canceled is J.K. Rowling. I realize that there are people who genuinely need jobs and you can hurt them by taking away their money. But you're just not, it's not realistic. It's not feasible. All the activists in the world could decide not to buy a J.K. Rowling book, and I just don't see it being an issue for her.
And again, I think it takes away from our intention and our abilities and our energy to cancel the things we want to cancel in terms of homophobia, racism, forms of sexism and discrimination. Yes, cancel culture omits. It's like cutting out that particular voice in a bigger discussion, but doesn't really address why that voice was there in the first place, right? Cancel culture is withdrawing support forever of that person. Yeah. But in that permanency doesn't really have the long-term impact that I think most people want from something like that, whether it's healing, whether it's, further discussion and dialogue, whether it's a better understanding of how somebody could carry those ideas and be a member of a community that I think there are some assumptions about, given the writing.
So then are you someone who then supports the idea, the premise of second chances?
I don't know that I call it second chances. I call it, I think this is a conversation around a willingness for self-growth, a willingness for self-awareness, a willingness for redemption. Within that, I'm capturing the idea that a person has to admit that they made a mistake.
Yeah.
Or they have to admit that they hurt somebody.
Yeah.
And J.K. Rowling, from what I've seen, does not really address the pain, the hurt, the mistake, the error. I could be wrong, but I'm not seeing that apology. And more than an apology is needed here. So I think second chances, well, it's not so much go about your business and try again. It's what are you going to do to unlearn this hate? What are you going to do to unpack why you have this hate?
Yeah.
What are you going to do to understand that you've caused pain? What does that look like?
Yeah. But she seems to be gatekeeping, and I don't mean to like keep harping on J.K. Rowling.
Yeah.
She just seems to be like in the news a lot right now. But she seems to be sort of gatekeeping her own pain, and because she has a painful history, particularly as far as men are concerned, and one could say that she is an ally in many progressive movements. However, she has this belief, it seems, I'm not speaking for her, but she has this belief, it seems, that the gender that wronged her can't decide to take on the responsibility of the pain that she and other women have felt. That having lived your life as a man for so long, over the course of your life, you've automatically been given a head start. You've automatically been given a privilege. And now you're trying to adapt.
So the sentiment is, how dare you try to embody my identity, my gender identity,
yes.
when you've lived as a different gender,
yes.
or were born as a different gender.
Yeah, you're trying to adopt my pain as your own.
That's just truly such a generalization and such a place of trauma.
Yeah.
For her to hold that much blame.
Yeah.
And that much misunderstanding of a trans identity, for her not to understand the lived experience of someone who's trans.
It's negating their own pain that she can't understand.
Yeah. And essentially completely discounting the fact, the known fact that persons who have a lived experience of being trans, by nature of their experience, are exposed to a lot of trauma and challenges related to their identity. So it's just incredibly complicated. And I agree, she's really not the person the show is about, and we don't talk about Harry Potter on the show very much, but I think it's I think it lifts up complexity about this process. Forgiveness is painful. It requires work. For me to forgive you, I'm putting work into it. And I think if someone is willing to put work back on their end to examine and undo the hurtful things that they've done, I think there's value to that.
Yeah.
So I think ultimately cancel culture is, it's not an end all be all, and it certainly isn't productive in the long run. So I think we have to be challenging ourselves to be a little bit more, a little bit more complex and multidimensional in the way we address it.
Yeah, because if you cancel someone, ultimately there is no incentive for that person to change. There's no reason for them to examine themselves any further, because they have no hope for redemption.
And I can think truly of a caveat from my personal life. The caveat being the moment that their mistake took away my humanity, the moment that their mistake was dehumanizing and essentially threatening my existence. I think that's where I draw the line and would likely not be interested in their redemption. And there are ways to address that. I don't need them to be canceled. Like maybe there's some other more personal ways to find balance and boundaries there, that I don't need to necessarily see some terrible things happen to them. Why would that happen? There are a handful of reasons that psychologists have named for why cancel culture is a go-to, why it's been so-called effective in many ways. One is that cancel culture can impact social status. Research shows that actually a lot of us care more about our sociometric status, which is like essentially a psychology word for like how much people admire us, like how much our peers deem us valuable, more than our socioeconomic status. So in many ways, people prefer admiration and social status versus financial or economic status. And cancel culture addresses that because we have, through social media, we have this, we're empowered to exercise cancel culture. Cancel culture also reduces the social status of enemies, and that can be very powerful. If you have, if there's somebody that someone you're against, someone who you see as your enemy, this is one route, one avenue to take that you can engage in that would essentially lower their social rank. So we really weaponize this, right? And then cancel culture strengthens social bonds. So certainly J.K. Rowling is a good example of this. Once the community rallied to come up with ways to respond and ways to uplift the voices of the trans community, then this became actually a bonding experience for some people, and I think could even be positive for some people. And I think something that is probably the most important part of cancel culture and why I think it's prevalent is that you get really fast results. You can see an outcome immediately within minutes, that there's perceived justice, there's perceived redemption, there's perceived outcome that feels like a relief for some people. And maybe they've sought out other avenues for justice, and this is the first time that they've felt like their story or their disclosure or, their statements are really being heard. And there I say, then we've got to improve our systems that do not provide the visibility and the validation that folks are really looking for, because the cancel culture, as much as it might be a quick fix, it is temporary.
Yeah. Drea, this was a great conversation. Until next time, why don't you tell the folks where they can find you online?
They can find me online on Twitter at Arkham Asylum Doc and on Instagram, Arkham Asylum Doc. My website is drdreapsychology.com.
You can find me at bward028 or at b_ward028 on Instagram. You can find us both on Twitter at Arkham Sessions. You can find us on Facebook. You can find us on Instagram at The Arkham Sessions. And you should go follow our family over at Fanbase Press, who is actually growing in size. The two owners of Fanbase Press just announced to the public that they are going to be having a family. So we want to congratulate them right here on the show. Also, we want to thank our patrons for helping make this possible. My father, Carl Ward, Eric O'Sullivan, Alex Hilk, Mike Blanchard, Leslie Brownlee, Jay Griffin Hughes, Michael Pruitt, Samir Bakhta, Wesley Farber, Rochelle Phillips, Vertigree, Maria Diego, Chris Tomera, Dr. Jerome Anderson, Ariel Neona, and Mr. Todd Stashwick. Thank you guys for your contributions and helping make this podcast possible. We promise we are going to be more active, especially for our patrons, in this coming month as we now are back on track and we are getting ready to give you a lot of really cool stuff. Look for example, my thoughts on DC Universe's Stargirl that is coming up next week. Until next time, I'm Brian Ward.
And I'm Dr. Drea Letamendi.
We are reminding you to go vote for what we're covering next. We are
The Arkham Sessions.
Took you emo navel gazers long enough to work through your bullshit.